Hello and welcome to Novara FM. I'm Eleanor Penny. This year, 2024, both the UK and the US are gearing up for a round of national elections, where the two-and-a-bit party systems both sides of the pond are pitting a hawkish centrism against a right-wing party that's moving ever further to the right. I'm recording right now in London, and on this side of the Atlantic, many pundits are predicting a complete wipeout of a fraught and sclerotic Tory party, saying that they are headed for electoral annihilation as the cost of living crisis spirals out of control and the promise of a muscular economy renewed by Brexit has completely failed to materialise. Meanwhile, in the United States, Donald Trump and Joe Biden are pretty much neck and neck in the polls. Trump is currently mired in legal trouble, and different conservative factions are squabbling for dominance, for the right to define what republicanism looks like in a possible second Trump term and beyond. So, as we face down these futures, we need to know who are these people and what do they want. In other words, what does transatlantic conservatism look like today, and what are its prospects as we trudge towards the polling stations this autumn? To find out more, I sat down with Matthew Sitman and Sam Adler-Bell. They're both writers based in the States, and together they host the podcast Know Your Enemy, guiding leftists through the rogues gallery of right-wing pundits, politicians and think tanks, and how they set the agenda for the world we live in today. We talked about conspiracy theories, forever wars, and if there's still a difference between the right and the far right. So, Sam, Matt, thank you so much for joining us. Really excited to get you guys on the podcast.
Very happy to be here. Thank you for having us. Hello.
Very happy to be here too.
Tell me more about your project first up. I'm interested to hear about how you conceive the power of knowing your enemies, right? What kind of knowledge do you want to equip us with? Maybe that's the you in knowing your enemies. Or what questions did you want to know when you were going into building this project?
Well, we've been doing Know Your Enemy now for what, Matt, 5 years?
Just about 5 years, yes. It was actually 5 years in May, I believe.
Wow, okay, 5-year anniversary. What we always say about this is that the truth is that Matt and I started doing this podcast before we started recording it, basically because we started having a series of conversations about the right in 2019 when Matt was my editor and he was working at Commonweal magazine, and he was assigning me to review new books by conservatives. And the whole world of American post-war conservatism was totally new to me, whereas for Matt, it wasn't entirely new because he had grown up on the right and been on the right into his 20s. And so I was basically his, tutee, and he was my tutor, and I was learning as much as I could about where these ideas came from. Of course, in 2019, it was an interesting time to be studying the American right. Trump was president. There was a lot of sort of ferment on the right. New sorts of ideas, post-liberal ideas were coming to the fore, and trying to make sense of what all that had to do with this sort of really intellectual side of conservatism had to do with what was happening on the ground was really important for us. And I guess as the title suggests, we're both leftists, and we did want to know, how did our enemies, our political opponents at the very least, manage to build this movement that started as a set of ideas and then blossomed into, this sort of hegemonic project that has really shaped American politics.
So you talk about this as a hegemonic project emerging out of the post-war right. I'm wondering how you guys would historicize the moment that we're in. It's like, when do the splits in the right and the different factions that we're seeing start emerging? I'm wondering if it would be useful to maybe do a little bit of table setting in terms of the terms that we're throwing around here when we talk about conservatism. We have neoconservatives, paleoconservatives, new right, neoliberals. So I would love to hear from you on how these sort of strands emerge and how we can start to tease them apart.
Well, from the very start of the post-war conservative movement, there were different factions in it, and they jostled for kind of supremacy and having their ideas win out. And really, frankly, the divisions we see on the right now at least in the United States, are very similar to the divides that have been in the conservative movement on the right from the start. Should foreign policy be driven more by neoconservative ideas, more aggressive, America imposing its will on the world, spreading democracy, a kind of activist foreign policy, or should it be, more of an America first, come home America, isolationist, if you will? Those divides go back to the very origins of the conservative movement and are still with us. Likewise, paleoconservatives, with whom we tend to identify Trump or his forerunners, someone like Pat Buchanan, who ran for president in 1992, and hit themes of economic protectionism, anti-NAFTA, anti-immigration, versus, pro-free markets, pro-immigration. I mean, these factions have been on the right from the start, and they're still there. And in some ways, Trump's election and what's happening on the right now marks a shift, I think, in terms of which factions are in power and kind of driving the right now. It was kind of the triumph of paleoconservatism in some ways, not perfectly, but Trump's critics in the Republican Party, some of the never-Trumpers, they're part of, either still are, someone like Nikki Haley, or kind of the ex-Republicans, never-Trumpers like Bill Kristol. They still kind of represent those different factions that, kind of are on the losing side right now on the right.
And as Matt's saying, I mean, from the very beginning, when we say from the beginning of post-war conservatism, we're talking about sort of the kind of conservatism in America that was born in the 1950s, hatched ideologically in the pages of National Review, which was founded by William F. Buckley Jr. in 1955. That from the origins of that post-war conservatism, there were different factions. And one of the challenges from the start was, how do we meld these factions together? And the term that came around that was used to describe this melding of these different factions was called fusionism. And fusionism was exactly this combination of traditionalist conservative ideas, a sort of Christian traditionalism with a sort of respect for sort of divine authority and hierarchy, melded with a libertarian conservatism, which was much more focused on free market economics. And the glue, as we say, that held these two sides together was the Cold War. In effect, it was the fight against communism at home and abroad. The fusionist consensus, as it came to be called, was really the sort of abiding theme of American conservatism for a long, long time. And it sort of held these different sides of intellectual conservatism in check, sort of held them together. And one of the things we talk about on the podcast is that there's a sense in which Trump's election broke open a lot of, and sort of revealed these fissures that had always been present in American conservatism, and sort of undermined the stability of the fusionist consensus, so that there were forces on the right who, had never really been all that invested in free markets and wanted some more sort of protectionist, sort of welfare chauvinist, support our own kind of policies, economic policies, more intervention in the market, at least for the sake of, their preferred constituencies. And then at the same time, the sort of traditionalist side of the fusionist bargain had felt that they had been left out and not taken as seriously as the free market side for a long, long time. And so Trump's election for them was also seen as an opportunity to reassert a much more sort of militant Christian identity on the right.
So we are staring down the barrel of two elections, one each side of the Atlantic. And on your side, a lot of people are predicting a second Trump term in office. Over here, of course, we are seeing the complete collapse into chaos of the Conservative Party. Keir Starmer's Labour Party is almost certainly going to secure quite a tub-thumping victory. So from your perspective all the way across the pond, I'm wondering what you see are the similarities and differences between those emergent factions or tendencies in conservatism in the UK versus in the US. I'm curious, I guess, specifically about how you think they imagine the problems that conservatism is trying to solve, if that makes sense.
So I find this very interesting, trying to do this compare and contrast, because there's a sense in which, look, I mean, Trump, in this case, just as a matter of punditry, is much better positioned to actually, take power back from the Democrats than Sunak is to keep power for the Conservatives in the UK. But there's also a sort of a sense to me in which the UK election seems to be so much less ideological in a sense than the contest in the US, where it sort of feels like these particular two avatars of conservatism and the left in the UK represent a kind of effort to put the cat back in the bag of, the sort of post-Brexit political battles in your country. They're both kind of, elite technocrats who are competing with each other to basically run the country more competently. Obviously, there's a sort of like basic differences in spending and taxing and so on. But in the U.S., we're still living in this moment where it still feels like we're living in the wake of Trump's election, where everything is still a little bit unmoored, where the ideological contest between the parties, at least in rhetoric and affect, is extremely severe. Both parties are very invested in the idea that they would run the country and sort of chart the course of its moral destiny in a fundamentally different direction. And that kind of feeling that in the UK there's a kind of, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, there's a sort of sense of trying to say, no, things are pretty much normal and we've got, two elite technocrats competing to run the country. Whereas here we've got Trump, on trial while running for office, continues to say really, truly insane things on the campaign trail pretty much every day. And we have Biden, who definitely represents, sort of an older liberal consensus in the country, but is very invested in identifying sort of fundamental moral and political differences between himself and the Democrats and the Republicans. So there seems to be a kind of maybe just a much more frenetic quality to our politics here now. And maybe in the UK, it seems like there's still a sort of frenetic nature to your politics, but they're trying to be contained. The election seems to be trying to contain them. I'd be interested in what you think about that, but also Matt.
After you, Matt.
Well, there's one thing I do want to add to this, which is something I've been thinking about in preparing for this conversation, which is that, Sam, the sense of normalcy, the kind of differences between kind of, Trump's America, the frenetic quality you were describing, and what's happening in the UK. I kind of wonder if that sense of normalcy might come from the fact that, Trump has never won more votes than the person he was running against for president. There's a sense, I think part of the reaction to Trump was the sense that because he was a minority president, that he did not win a majority of the votes or even a plurality of the votes. There was something unjust and it kind of added to the authoritarian menace and the kind of prospect of minority rule that Trump exemplified. And I do think in the UK, Brexit won in a referendum. Boris Johnson, when he defeated Jeremy Corbyn in 2019, right, won a resounding majority. There's a sense that maybe what's happening in the UK was chosen more by a greater swath of the population than what's happening in the US.
Yeah, live with it, Eleanor. You chose this.
It's my fault. I knew it. Take it to my therapist. But when you guys were talking, what it brings to mind is, I guess, how we think about these incumbent parties as representative of capital's interest, right? And obviously, as good Marxists, we are probably not aliens to the idea that, both major parties in a two-party system will probably be interested in ushering in capital interests in different formations. Mm-hmm. But these kinds of fissures in capitalist classes that are emerging both in the UK and in the US in response to shifting structural crises in capitalism itself seem to be reflected in these sort of forms of internecine warfare in the different parties. I'm wondering what your take is on that. Like, how much are we seeing those internal factional fissures representing different parts of capital's interests across the pond?
Well, one thing this is a comment and a question, as annoying people say at panels and academic conferences. But I do think, and you really can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but I do think the American right, especially the post-war, post-1945 U.S. conservative movement, and then kind of the Republican Party as it became increasingly influenced by the conservative movement in the U.S. I think the U.S. right has always been a bit more ideological, a bit, sharper edges. And there's a sense in which, a kind of Burkean, I always hate to invoke Burke when I talk about conservatism in some ways, because he was not a Tory. He was a member of the Liberal Party. But a kind of Burkean, less ideological, as Michael Oakeshott put it in his, a British conservative philosopher who put it in his famous essay, Rationalism in Politics, that in political activity, men sail a boundless and bottomless sea. There's neither harbor for shelter nor floor for anchorage, neither starting place nor appointed destination. The enterprise is to keep afloat on an even keel. And I thought, that is not all of the British right or British conservatism, but it is a strain of it, and it's a strain that is kind of absent from American conservatism. The kind of most famous Burkean on the post-war right was Russell Kirk. He put Burke right at the start of his book, The Conservative Mind. Kirk argued that the American kind of constitution and political experience was deeply indebted to the British political experience. But Russell Kirk was kind of an eccentric. He was not, he was an important figure in the post-war conservative movement, but he definitely was a kind of minority opinion, a kind of minority view, and a bit of an eccentric, and harbored kind of more Tory notions of what conservatism should be, which is to say, not an ideology. That was Kirk's main thing, not an ideology. And I do think, some of the differences we might be trying to get at does reflect some of these kind of historical differences between the right in the two countries. And I think, too, to kind of add one layer to that comment, I do think in the UK, there was an old regime. Right, the Conservative Party, the Tories, they have that element of the aristocracy, which formally in the United States we never had. Tocqueville says we were born equal in the United States. There never had to be a democratic revolution in one sense, and so that aspect that I think is present in the Tory Party isn't there in the United States. And in America, the right really it's funded by and does a lot of the bidding of entrepreneurs, people who business people, people who have made a fortune. They fund the foundations. They are one of the main constituencies of the right. And I feel like, some of those differences matter maybe in what we're seeing now. The kind of lack of direction it seems like the Tory party has. That's kind of a historically specific development, but it also, I would say, is not entirely unreflective of the kind of histories I'm invoking here.
I have something to say about the sort of factions of capital, at least at work in the Democrats versus the Republicans. I do think that one of the things we've seen over the past couple decades is that the Democrats increasingly do get a lot of support from big corporations. Big corporations which have, at least implicitly via their shareholders, a kind of more constituents, but also are much more invested in sort of international trade, a sort of stable global economy, a kind of predictable, stable capitalism. And increasingly, the Republican Party is supported by a different different faction of capital, but namely much more privately owned business capital, much more family owned business. So it may be just as profitable and even as big a company, but it's not corporately held. It's not publicly traded. And that does, I think, have an effect on the kinds of economic policies that are pursued by either party, even as we would all agree, they're all, want capitalism to go on creating profit and generating growth. That the Republicans having increasingly more support from sort of idiosyncratic, family-owned, possibly very large fortunes does mean that there's a little more wiggle room to do some really crazy stuff, to be invested in more destabilizing forms of protectionism, tariffs in particular, of course, because that we could just support. It's a kind of clientelism. You can just the Republican Party can pass a tariff that benefits one faction of capital at the expense of others because their capital backers may be less interconnected into the global economy, which would be disrupted by protectionist policymaking. So I think that's. And that's something that has developed over the past few years, and I think was accelerated by Trump, who himself, is a family capitalist.
Can I add one point to this? This doesn't have to do with business interests specifically, but it does get to, I think, another difference, and I think an important one between the right in the United States and in the UK, which is how religious the American right is. And in a way that I think that the term maybe you would use across the pond would be religious enthusiasm, right? These are fiery evangelicals on moral crusades in a way that I think in the UK with an established church, which I think sometimes has a moderating influence, I don't think conservatism in the UK is identified so closely with militant evangelical conservative Christianity. At least not in the same way. And I think that's another major kind of, the election season we're in now in the United States, I think the religious dimension of it and the kind of moral issues that the Republican Party wants to keep front and center, I think that's worth noting as well.
Yeah. I actually think it is related to the business side of things too, because these private, or privately held companies and family capitalists, they often have a lot more sort of like explicit ties, either in sort of affiliation or in terms of the sort of programs that they fund to the religious right, and just can kind of just take a bunch of money from their company and give it to some sort of, religious right-wing initiative. Whereas, a giant corporation, with enormous number of shareholders who probably have a bunch of different religious affiliations among them, doesn't do that as much.
Yeah, and just to give a specific example, Sam, of the kind of economic strata you're talking about. One example, and this is one that gets discussed all the time in the United States, is, we like to think, or, often people describe the typical Trump voter as, some down and out white working class voter in Appalachia. But really, probably Trump's strongest supporters are, people who own car dealerships in the Midwest, right?
Right.
That's what Sam means, I think, by kind of, one kind of example of a certain family-owned business. But that is deeply often linked to evangelical Christianity in the United States. There's businessmen's Bible studies, right?
Yeah.
Every Tuesday morning, you get coffee and donuts and do a Bible study with fellow business leaders in your community. Those two things often are joined at the hip in the United States.
It's interesting that when you talk about that kind of difference between what is trying to be conserved in conservatism, right? And this maybe an inflated imaginary of stability in sort of the UK right imaginary. And I'm interested by that link that you draw on to a sort of a landedness of the wealth tied to this sort of ancient aristocracy, which is sometimes mind-boggling to remember just how much land it actually owns and just how much of UK wealth it actually has a stranglehold on. But when you mention the issue of tariffs and the idea of this kind of tactical, almost isolationism that is available in the US, maybe in a less wrecking ball way than it is available in the UK, that does appear to me to be one of the main strains of, I guess, similarity, or at least sort of parallel histories between the UK and the US at the moment, in that the way in which conservatism or right-wingness, if you like, is being formulated is in terms of its foreign policy, its relationship to isolationism, right? In the UK, you of course have the question of Brexit, and you've got Liz Truss and historically unfortunate boyfriend Kwasi Kwarteng and Rees-Mogg and all that lot in the European Research Group, tanking the economy in 2 weeks, very memorably. Yeah. And you also have what seems kind of almost to be a little bit like a break from the established order in Trump and his acolytes talking and acting in more isolationist terms, both in terms of trade and towards the issue of, for instance, Ukraine. What do you guys make of that?
As far as the foreign policy part of it, and I think we've I hope we've sort of sketched the economic side. Obviously, for the economic side, there's a sense for the right, the sort of the new right, the Trumpist right, that these sort of economic entanglements, this investments in global trade have produced a kind of rootlessness in the American elite, which isn't attached to specifically American interests, specifically American people and places sufficiently. Whereas if we focus more on making things at home, building things at home, and shifting the trade deficit in America's favor, the elites, the people in positions of power in the country, would be more attached to America's singular and specific and sort of selfish prosperity against the sort of global lifting of all boats that neoliberal globalism represents. So that's the economic side. I think with isolationism on the foreign policy side, I mean, this is an interesting thing which kind of has to do with the end of the Cold War, and then subsequently the Cold War consensus about America's role in the world was it was challenged by the 1990s when there was no multipolar enemy for the U.S. Foreign policy elite, but they kind of got their groove back with the War on Terror, which sort of regenerated a conflict that required, in their minds and in the ideological sort of spectacle that they were generating, required American leadership on the global stage and a sort of reassertion of American military hegemony. But as those wars wound down and also became extremely unpopular in this country, the sort of neocon vision that Matt was talking about earlier of America exerting its will in the world and spreading democracy became very unpopular, not just on the left, as it was, basically from the start, but with Republican voters who felt that why are we spending all this money abroad, these wars? Why are we sending, blood and treasure to be lost in the Middle East? And Trump really, when he ran in a way that I think we can easily forget, but is absolutely crucial to his appeal and also why he was so disruptive. He ran against America's forever war. I mean, he ran against the Iraq War, and he promised to get out of Afghanistan, which eventually his successor did. But the point being that Trump said during the debates with Republicans in the primaries in 2015, 2016, he said, George W. Bush, the second Bush president, didn't keep us safe on 9/11. Which was just like when it was true, and but it was crazy. It was like that was one thing you could never say. And then and he referred to the Iraq War as stupid, and that really undermined that kind of American muscular foreign policy, interventionist foreign policy side of the fusionist coin in a fundamental way. And really that was sort of the opening for these more paleocon tendencies, these more isolationist tendencies, these tendencies that go back to the old right, the pre-war right, the America First right, which basically says, why should America be involved in all this, foreign meddling, and why should we be involved in European affairs, but also why should we be sending our troops to die in the Middle East?
I did have one comment specifically on tariffs and kind of economic protectionism. that I did want to kind of mention and then ask a question, because one thing I do think in the way we have talked about what's happening in the UK and the United States politically these past few years, one common thread that is, I think, real to some degree is that the right was picking up voters and gaining strength in places that previously had been Democratic Party strongholds in the United States or Labor strongholds in the UK, places where deindustrialization was wreaking havoc, places where kind of quote-unquote white working class voters, downwardly mobile working class voters, people without a college degree, the right was gaining adherence in that particular, among that demographic. For example, one of the things from the 2019 UK elections that kind of blew my mind when I first read it was that of the 54 seats that the Conservative Party gained that year, 52 of them were in areas that voted to leave in 2016.
Yep.
But one thing I kind of wanted, the question of that is, since that is a trope and one based at least in some reality, even if it's overblown sometimes, I think what Sam was describing with Trump, it's more rhetorical than policy at this point. But if you look on the broader right in the United States, there's a whole kind of network of think tanks and journals, policy shops cropping up to kind of create a policy agenda that aligns with at least Trump's rhetoric in 2016 about jobs, about economic populism, protectionism, anti-NAFTA. We're bringing the jobs back. We're not getting screwed over anymore.
Even superficially pro-labor.
Right, superficially pro-labor in a way. But that is, in a sense, the Republican Party and the conservative movement in the United States responding kind of realities on the ground and a kind of, the influx of new constituents for them. And that's actually a response to real things happening in the world, real political developments. And my question is, have the Tories done anything like that? Or frankly, has Brexit and kind of the fallout from it and cleaning up that mess to the extent possible just so dominated kind of economic policy discussions in the UK that, that might be to blame. But I'm just wondering if there's been a similar adjustment.
It's interesting because there is this key dilemma in modern conservatism that very much imagines itself as the inheritors of Thatcher's mission, right? To put a wrecking ball through what was a kind of post-war civil compact between Labour and capital. Now, as we know, that is kind of a romanticised history that ignores the fact that, that compact actually contained a lot of struggle and a lot of people fighting and losing their jobs and being punished by capital in order to secure that compact. But nonetheless, this is how Thatcher and then her heirs have imagined their role in sort of essentially disciplining Labour on behalf of capital, and part of the way in which you do that and make your economy more muscular, more efficient, et cetera, is to privatize everything, right? The standard story of neoliberalism, whereby a lot of what was previously public wealth gets flogged into private hands, and you get a sort of somewhat of a boost in your in certain areas of the economy, particularly in housing speculation. And what conservatism saw going alongside that was also a boost in their voter base, because you get people who could now own their own homes for the first time in their life through things like right to buy, and you get sort of dyed-in-the-wool conservatives that way. Now, speaking in 2024, the cupboards are empty. There's really nothing left to sell off, and the rivers are, full of human effluent. It's a little bit of a mess. And when the Tories are imagining what, according to their own economic programme, and also the massive fall off in GDP that is partly at least to do with Brexit and also partly to do with many other Tory issued dilemmas such as, austerity, they don't really have a way of recreating their own voter base by a use of state power that has a sort of a robust economic offer to it. And so what their use of state power in order to try and claw back votes is looking like at the moment is thinking about that kind of classic fascist declinism. We need to renew the state through renewing its violent capacities. We need to reinvest in borders. We need to reinvest in policing. Like right now, as we are speaking, literally as we are recording, there are immigration deportation vans being blockaded in the streets of Peckham by protesters because they're trying to snatch people to take them off onto the Bibi Stockholm, the sort of concentration camp barge. And that's a very kind of, it's an interesting thing to see sort of looking across the pond at like what a conservative embrace of the possibility of state power looks like as we kind of move from a kind of classical neoliberal night watchman state, we're going to let capital do its thing, style of politics into a more, I guess, maybe interventionist, you could say, style of politics. So I'm wondering about that particular use of state power and how, I guess, republicanism imagines its sort of future voting base.
I do think, like, yes, Matt's right that there's a sort of network of more kind of economically interventionist think tanks and sort of intellectuals who are associated with the right and who are pushing kind of the Republicans to be this kind of pro-labor conservative party. That being said, that those ideas aren't exactly carrying the day. And I was reminded when you were speaking that the main kinds of investments, actual sort of like, government investments in the economy, in jobs that the last Trump administration and the next one are most likely to do are precisely in those kind of repressive apparatus institutions. I mean, it's always more money to the military, more and more money to the military, but also incredibly importantly for this version of the Republican Party is militarizing the border with Mexico. And that has, the kind of idea of an invasion of migrants from the South, from South America and Central America is if not the most important theme in Trump's reelection campaign, it's up there. Matt, wouldn't you say it's got to be top one or two issues, and
yes,
and that also involves a kind of repressive apparatus Keynesianism. I mean, they put money into the coffers of the Border Patrol, and the Border Patrol actually is a kind of interesting demographic constituency for this new version of republicanism, because they actually are much more likely to be themselves Latino, working class Latinos, but who have at least been here for a generation or two, and who are doing the work of rounding up new migrants. But that means, and this is sort of in Texas border towns, this is contributing to a trend that we can see in the sort of voter bases of the respective voter bases of the parties, that Republicans are gaining with Hispanics. And at least some of that has to do with this actual, not just ideological affinity with, protecting the border from these new migrants, but also this actual economic stimulus that is going into funding new kinds of border protection initiatives, which provide jobs to people along the border. And to the extent that there is a kind of, real force behind the message of we're going to reinvest in America, I think it's still fair to say that most of the places where you see that is via the repressive state, investments in military, in munitions, and in border protection.
I think in recent years on the American right, one of the biggest shifts, both I think conceptually and rhetorically, is their embrace of wielding state power for their moral ends. Meaning when the old fusionism that Sam described earlier, which was economically mostly libertarian, when that held sway, and when the Republican Party, was still, I would say, a liberal party rather than an illiberal one, at least in many ways, they took seriously kind of liberal rights in a way, or at least, again, rhetorically they did. Freedom of religion, religious liberty on the right in the American context is a major issue, or at least it had been for a long time. There was a general squeamishness about wielding state power on the right in the post-war era. We have to remember that one of the major instigating factors for the post-war right was Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, right, and the increase in state power. So a kind of skepticism of state power kind of held across the board, at least, again, rhetorically, on the right. And there were nods to liberal rights and values. Again, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of speech, a kind of, the rights that in a pluralistic liberal society kind of allow people to encounter each other on roughly even ground. And now what we're seeing is the right saying, no, we are going to use the state for our preferred moral ends in a robust way. So anti-trans legislation, anti-choice legislation regarding abortion. These are things that, the right, always wanted to regulate abortion, ban it, outlaw it. But there's a kind of just embrace of state power here in a new way. And again, just the way they talk is different. They want to wield state power to kind of crush their enemies and kind of the people they don't like, put them kind of on the wrong end of state power. And that's not entirely new on the right, again, but I definitely think it's a shift post-Trump to talking about using state power in a certain way and the ends for which they want to use it. That's a notable change.
So I'd love to know more about how you think the right, both in the UK and the US, imagines those enemies that they are possibly trying to crush with state power, and also where they are. Are they being imagined as internal enemies, external enemies? I'm seeing from my perspective, at least, kind of on both sides of the pond, a rise in a sort of conspiracist framework of thinking of who the enemies are, where they are, and also how they operate.
Yeah, I mean, my instinct is similar. I think that in the U.S., for sure, there's a sense that there are external and internal enemies, and that the internal enemies, including these kind of rootless cosmopolitan elites, Reed, in many instances, Jews, are sort of facilitating the invasion by the external enemies. This is the kind of great replacement idea that it's a sort of fascist idea that has a lot of purchase all over the global right. But it's the idea that there are sort of elites who are, in particular, democratic elites who are importing foreign migrants, both for the purposes of shoring up a kind of cheap labor regime that doesn't rely on American, rooted native workers, but also which benefits the Democratic Party. I mean, this is something that you will see basically every night on Fox News, our major conservative network, which suggests that these kind of, these globalist elites are facilitating the quote-unquote invasion of foreign migrants for their own economic, selfish economic reasons, and for the political gain of the Democratic Party. So that's a sort of way in which the external and internal enemies are connected. I think the sort of internal enemies that are characterized by the conservatives as moral deviants, the gays and trans people, and so on, they're kind of constructed as also a kind of elite phenomenon, a sort of phenomenon of the highly educated and decadent parts of American society, and that the Democrats, the liberals, are imposing this novel, way of thinking about the human person and gender onto a kind of, hidebound American folk who find all of this very confusing and silly and unnerving and, or offensive to their religious beliefs. So it's basically like all trans people are rich, and the rich are importing poor people from abroad to help the Democrats. I mean, it's all very conspiratorial, and of course, materially, demographically speaking, isn't true. Of course, there are trans people in every class, and they will all be harmed by the Republicans' sort of increasingly vicious policies toward them. But that's
right,
the kind of
transness it's one of the ways of experiencing class as well. Right?
Sure,
I think
yeah.
what's the numbers of for unemployment for trans people? It's astronomical.
Exactly. So it's obviously a conspiracy, a delusion, a ideology, but that is the kind of essence of the way that the external and the internal are related, as far as I can tell.
Mm-hmm. So in the crux of these sort of similarities, differences that we've been teasing out, what next for the so-called Blair Bush era special relationship? I'm thinking particularly because there is an undeniable sort of decline in just the baseline economic fortunes of the UK, on which the kind of practical arrangement or the practical benefits of the so-called special relationship was founded. Similarly, being no longer in the European Union, the special relationship no longer gives the US a sort of a foothold by proxy in the EU. So I'm wondering what you guys foresee in terms of that dynamic, and also like how is that special relationship being talked about in the US? I mean, is it being talked about at all, or are we just truly irrelevant? That would not surprise me either.
It's interesting. I suspect in doing some reading for this conversation, I knew in a broad sense that economic conditions in the UK weren't great. In a way that's not entirely dissimilar from the United States, right? The kind of aftermath of neoliberalism, austerity, so on and so forth, right? We were living in that time when people's lives, their economic lives, were very precarious, and all the kind of ills that attend neoliberalism and austerity. I just assumed those were at work in the UK, but actually reading some of the numbers and accounts of what is going on there, especially outside of a big city like London, I think most Americans just really have no idea.
It's bad.
What's. I mean, you could say that about any country in the world. Not just the UK. Americans don't have a clue about it. But I do think it's kind of the special relationship is running on a bit of nostalgia and maybe even running out of steam. It's just not something I hear people talk about that much. And it's a mix of ignorance about the ways things really are bad in the United Kingdom, and I think some of the details of working out Brexit. Like just what's happening there. I don't think many Americans know.
I would actually love to know what shocked you, like when you were coming across different aspects of. I guess you could put it in depressing terms how bad it is. What surprised you there?
I would just say, I mean, sometimes it's the specific details. There was a piece that Sam Knight wrote in The New Yorker that came out just a month or two ago. And, things like the number of libraries or courtrooms that have been shut down in certain towns, out of, 30 some odd, sites, 32 of them get cut. The kind of... the economic numbers, the decline in the standard of living, decline in wages, and frankly, the extent to which the UK just didn't emerge out of the 2008 financial crisis in a way that even the United States, however anemic and kind of too slow and too austerity-driven our recovery from the 2008 financial crisis, it seems to have been an even less complete and less, robust recovery in the UK. So just kind of the economic indicators, but especially as they relate to quality of life, they really were surprising to me how bad they were. And I was surprised to hear people and again, the Sam Knight essay I just referenced, kind of looking to the United States as a place with a more robust civil society and the kind of infrastructure of society being newer and better, which is kind of a shock for we Americans to hear. But but hearing that language just made me think, yes, things really do seem dire there in a way that, again, I don't think most Americans realize, and that I think just it's just not something that we discuss a lot. Like, it's just not something I hear much about, like the quote unquote special relationships, apart from kind of obligatory incantations and, the photo ops with Sunak and Biden or whatever. But it does seem like, especially after Brexit, it's just a mess over there. And I think that's reflected in sort of how we talk about our relationship with the UK and what Americans know about it.
So something that does seem somewhat more healthy is what you might be able to categorize as a right-wing special relationship. The idea of this racial compact of like an imagined Western civilization, sort of diasporic whiteness, if that makes any sense, as a counterpoint or a foil to a more bordered nationalism, seems to be on the rise. Or certainly there are shared figures, shared intellectual influences across the Anglophone right. Can you tell us, I guess, who the right-wing people in power or who are looking to be in power, who are they listening to? What are their influences? Who are the intellectuals, and I'm making massive scare quotes here on this audio format, that they are listening to, and what are those lines of connection like?
We could talk about the post-liberals, the National Conservative Conference, which I know that was held at least once in the UK. And these are sort of the figures that Matt was referring to earlier, who in the U.S. context want the conservative governments to wield, the levers of state to enforce a much more robust and traditionalist moral orthodoxy. And they look to other sort of statesmen and would-be statesmen who seem to be doing that or aspiring to be doing that too. I mean, it's incredible in America how popular Viktor Orban in Hungary is amongst our conservative elites. I mean, not least because, nobody in the U.S., as Matt mentioned, is really talking about the special relationship with the U.K., our kind of longest ally and former colonial masters. But the amount that conservatives on the right, especially the sort of Trumpist conservatives, talk about Hungary, an actual economic backwater with very little, sort of geopolitical importance. How often conservative intellectuals and elected conservatives talk about Orban's Hungary as a sort of model for implementing a much more it's kind of a Christian, a liberal democracy, there's particular figures that sort of are representative of this sort of post-liberal tendency, which tend to have more sympathy for the Orban project and similar things. There's people like Matt's former teacher Patrick Deneen. There's Gladden Papin. There's Adrian Vermeule, the Harvard Catholic integralist. These are people who would, some of them would be involved in the National Conservatism Conference and sort of would be convening these kinds of international right confabs. But, of course, there's a sort of obvious and maybe even too obvious to point out irony here that it's a sort of nationalist international. What kinds of relationships do these pseudo nationalist and would-be nationalist leaders want to have with each other? Is it just like, let's talk about some cool ideas? Or are there kind of actual economic or foreign policy relationships that they would like to kind of hammer out and have in a future kind of fortress state style global order? That I'm less clear on.
Yes, and it might be worth kind of adding some historical context here, because in terms of intellectual networks and connections between the right in the U.S. and the U.K., I do think, it's interesting to think about what's happening now with the relationship between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, but also the conservative movements in both parties, the way they related to each other. And it does seem to me that there was a real kind of back and forth during that era in the 70s and 80s, where Reagan and Thatcher were both personally so close, seemingly, and so simpatico ideologically, but that also, again, was reflected in think tanks and kind of free market think tanks and, kind of trafficking in ideas back and forth. And even someone like John O'Sullivan, who was an advisor to Thatcher, was for a period of time the editor of National Review, based in New York City, the magazine funded by William F. Buckley Jr. It is interesting that John O'Sullivan now is very involved with Orban in Hungary.
Yeah.
So there was that kind of trafficking in ideas back and forth, a lot of sympathy, but it was very intellectual too, like at the idea of books and writing and think tanks and policy papers. What I notice now is the infrastructure seems a bit less robust. And instead of, American free market think tanks that loved Ronald Reagan and free market think tanks in the UK that loved Margaret Thatcher, we're now having like Nigel Farage show up at the Republican National Convention. Right? Mm-hmm. So there are connections, but it seems they're almost of a different kind right now. Maybe that's because, in the United States, the infrastructure on the right around a more populist, nationalist, America first set of policies is still in its infancy in some ways. And maybe that pivot hasn't really happened in the UK yet. So there are things, like Sam mentioned, of the National Conservatism outfit, holding one of their conferences in the UK. But what that means at the policy level and the true kind of exchange of ideas, I'm not really sure. And I think it's still not what, say, the relationship between the right in the US and the UK was in the Reagan-Thatcher era.
When you talk about how much fangirling there is of Viktor Orban on the part of the American right, and I would suggest that was actually true in maybe less explicit, more classically British, ham-fisted sometimes terms for the right over here, even though there are people like Suella Braverman who will talk very, very openly about literally, Nazi conspiracy theories, echoing all that kind of language. You have people who are supporting an out-and-out far-right fascist government and saying, yep, look at that over there. That's what we want. That's our model. Is it still useful to broker differences between the right and the far right? Or are we just talking about a difference between grassroots / astroturfed movements and, people with suits and power and that kind of thing?
I do think that hard distinctions between the far right and the right are breaking down now. Maybe, those distinctions always were something of a mistake or overplayed. The distinctions were made too forcefully. So I do think we are in an era when, yes, kind of the influence, the way the far right kind of sets the agenda for the right, influences, the political parties that represent the right in mainstream politics. I do think, how we're thinking about that is in flux. But I do want to say in particular that I've been thinking about this a lot in the American context. And we've been mentioning the kind of burgeoning intellectual infrastructure around a more America first agenda in the United States, kind of, Trumpism in practice, Trumpism at a policy level, maybe. And one thing I do think is true is that, the relationship between the far right and the mainstream right, especially at the intellectual level, is one of, well, in some ways laundering the ideas of the far right, right? Like the mainstream conservative intellectuals that have pivoted to a more nationalist stance, America first, kind of have adjusted to Trump. It's kind of, like rendering certain ideas from the far right in more plausible terms or cleaning them up, giving them a more intellectual gloss. And so there's a lot of, I think, subtle trafficking even between far right and a quote unquote more mainstream right. I think that's kind of one of the interesting parts of the moment we're in, is seeing how, as the right adjusts to this new moment and the institutions they build, the conferences they hold, the magazines they start, how they handle the dynamic you asked about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think something we've talked about, Matt and I, together on the podcast before is that the necessity for something like the National Conservatism Conference, which brings together these sort of scions of the more establishment and formally respectable right, together with these kind of more formerly fringy elements on the right, the paleocons that were kind of written out of the movement for a long time, the more nativist, the more racist, the more isolationist parts of the right, that they all have to get into a room and hash things out, is a sign that there really were distinctions. I mean, the distinctions still exist. They just have to figure out how to work together. Another interesting example of this is the think tanks that are sort of competing to staff a possible next Trump White House. So, you know, when as they hope, when Trump wins, there'll be a transition period, and there'll be a lot of jockeying for jobs in that White House. And there are a couple of different think tanks that are sort of positioning themselves to lead that effort. And one of them is the Heritage Foundation, which is, you know, a classic old, you know, it's one of the sort of the most important post-war conservative think tanks, especially for the sort of Reagan era. So insofar as the sort of ideas that were hatched in National Review found their flourishing in the Reagan presidency in the 80s, Heritage Foundation was the kind of white paper, actual policy muscle behind the Reagan Revolution. So one might think that the Heritage Foundation would not be 100% on board with this new Trumpian, less free market oriented, you know, in some cases anti-Reaganite consensus. But in fact, the Heritage Foundation has totally pivoted and sort of tried to build this big tent within its this program that it has for the transition called Project 2025, which basically is sort of saying, like, let's bring the whole right together, the far right, the center, you know, everybody, let's all get together and we'll hash it out. And, you know, we're not the old fuddy-duddies of the Reagan consensus anymore. We want to be on the cutting edge, and we want to be leading this effort. And I think that's also a real sign of where the kind of center of gravity is in conservative thought in the U.S. That an organization as sort of traditional fusionist conservative as the Heritage Foundation has repositioned itself as, you know, the most kind of Trumpian populist outlet.
You talk about hashing things out. I'm curious about what kind of party discipline, or I guess ideological discipline, looks like, and how that sort of changes or shapes what is possible on a statement level, on a policy level, from individual Republicans. Obviously, over here we have the whipping system, which is, I mean, so much of parliamentary terminology that makes me think England is just not real. England is just like unjustifiable, but it is nonetheless called the whipping system, whereby you can obviously be chucked out of the party if the Prime Minister just doesn't like the cut of your jib for whatever reason. So what does that discipline look like, and how does it compare to what happens over here?
Well, I think one of the main things to note is that party discipline in the American political system is almost non-existent. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the key differences rooted in the different political systems between, our two countries in terms of everything we've been talking about. It's just American politics. Individual politicians are entrepreneurial. Even now, the way our fundraising or, the money in political campaigns, the way that is regulated, or rather not regulated in the United States, it means that, that key tool of party discipline, who you fund, giving funds for a campaign to your preferred candidate, that now, that lone kind of tool doesn't even really exist anymore. So it's kind of a wild west in terms of party discipline in the United States, I'd say. But this is where, but you still need it, right? If you have an ideological project, you still need it. And this is where some of what Sam was mentioning is so important. Something like Project 2025, which, among other things, is a project to identify and credential ideologically sound people for a second Trump administration. Right, like there will literally be lists of people, spreadsheets that these people, their hand has been stamped, like they have been approved by the institutions on the right that are leading these efforts, like the Heritage Foundation. So I think like the ideological discipline comes from, what the line is gets hashed out in some of these conferences that we've been describing, in the pages of some of the magazines and journals on the right, so on and so forth. But then once that line like starts to settle into something, kind of stable and it seems like it's going to stick, I think this is where then the ideological discipline comes in. And that really, I think, again, it's a function of the conservative institutions that were built after World War II in the United States on the right? Like they really have a kind of pipeline of talent, of ways of cultivating young people in a way there's no real equivalent on the left in the United States. But I think that's where, again, the discipline comes in. It's the way the conservative network, the institutions, that is where the discipline comes in.
There's an important distinction to be made here. Matt's right that they are cultivating talent and identifying them as ideologically reliable through these initiatives like Heritage's Project 2025. But it's really important to point out that these are not the staffers that they're identifying will staff the administrative state. They will staff the White House. Right. They will staff the federal government, not be, selected to run for Congress. I mean, this is another difference between our systems where even the cabinet appointees in the American system, they'll only very rarely come from Congress or the Senate unless it's a very, very safe seat that can either be reappointed by a governor. They just don't want to risk losing an election by putting somebody who's already elected into the White House. So these staffers that we're talking about being credentialed, they will be using the levers of federal power, the administrative state, the agencies, basically, which is where executive power is implemented in the American system. So, the fact that there's so much emphasis, I mean, there's always been an emphasis on planning for the next transition and finding the right people to staff these agencies. But I do think that it's another sign of a little bit of a changeover from the old fusionist way of doing things, which was that, at least in principle, the Reagan era conservatives, which sort of prevailed until very recently, would say, well, we don't want to do anything with these agencies. We just want to dismantle them because we don't think the federal government should be using executive power to, shape the economy or regulate people in their individual lives. Conservatives don't really say that anymore. And the thing that they say is that we sort of learned, this is what they'll say, we learned from watching the left that actually you need to use executive power maximally to your advantage to sort of shape your version of what the good life is in this country. And in particular, because they've seen, and this is actually true, that there's an enormous amount of gridlock in our actual legislative system, that there still are a lot of checks on the ability of even a party with a trifecta, meaning they control the Senate and the House and the White House, to actually implement large-scale legislative change. Because the Republicans have seen that, they are much more willing and eager to use executive power, the agency power, around the edges of existing law to implement their agenda. And that's why this credentialing process is so important, and why they're much less sheepish about saying, yes, we're going to staff the White House with ideological true believers who will run every angle, use every single tool at their disposal, to punish our enemies and reward our friends.
Yes, no, totally. This is where everything Sam was just describing goes hand in glove with my earlier comment about the kind of noticing on the right the new embrace of deploying state power, right, rather than a more libertarian rhetoric. Or as Sam was saying, saying we're going to abolish the Department of Education. That's actually hard to do, and so they'd make those kind of libertarian promises that would never actually happen, right? But now they're saying we want to wield state power in a way that seems different than the right, than the way the right talked before. And how do you do that? Well, just as Sam was describing, you go into the belly of the administrative state, staff it with all of your ideological loyalists, and then use those institutions, use those departments and their powers for right-wing ends, rather, again, than just kind of maintaining the status quo with libertarian promises of eventually wanting to dismantle these, say, the Department of Education. And there's one other, just to kind of underscore that, though, as Sam also mentioned, kind of planning to staff a new administration is commonplace. It happens every time, right? A new president is elected. There's nothing nefarious about that per se. But in the past, when various right-wing think tanks and institutions were kind of, places where administrations in waiting, could stay in D.C. and kind of wait for the next Republican president. What that meant before, like, say, under George W. Bush, was that the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, a lot of their people staffed the Bush administration, but that mostly meant like high-level presidential appointees, right, in the State Department or the National Security Council, kind of high-level advisors. There were a lot of people from AEI around George W. Bush. But what's different now is it's not just that. It's specifically aimed at kind of infiltrating and taking over the administrative state, again, in a way that that seems new, that seems different than in the past. And this is also why one thing that's been floated is Trump changing the classification of certain federal employees so that what now might be a kind of civil service job or like officially a nonpartisan, kind of bureaucratic job based mostly on expertise and credentials.
Which stays the same from administration to administration. You don't get to replace them when you take power.
Right, exactly. Trump is talking about changing their classification so that they can be replaced with the people who are credentialed by the institutions we were just describing. So this is something kind of different rhetorically, and it seems like practically, the way it's being put into practice. This isn't just the same old staffing up for a new administration.
Yeah, there's that question of sort of state formation that we're dancing around as well, because, classically the retort to this, or the mirror image of that kind of like staffing question to provide the bulwark for the ideological change that you want to see in the UK is the civil service, right? It's famously thought of by some left-wing analysts as something that was put in place basically to prevent a robust and thoroughgoing democracy after universal enfranchisement was brought in. I think it's one of the institutions that made, I think it was Neil Acheson, I'm sure listeners will correct me if it isn't, to say that it's not possible to produce democracy from the ancient institutions of the British state in the same way that it's not possible to induce a vulture to give milk. So it does kind of force us to ask, okay, who are these people, right? And so who are the people who you are looking at, both in the UK and the US, to tell us about the shape of conservatism to come?
Well, I don't know if Matt has a lot of particular people in mind. I mean, there are certainly like sort of cabinet members in waiting for a future Trump administration. A lot of them are also installed at these think tanks and sort of sinecure no-show jobs where they can just wait around and get a salary for the next White House to come around. They're not terribly dissimilar from what his last cabinet was like, although it will probably be, importantly, this is an important distinction, it will probably be people who are more reliably loyal to him and his program than was the case in 2016, because nobody on the right actually thought Trump was going to win. And there weren't nearly, as much as Matt is right that this sort of creation of an alternative Trumpist infrastructure in the think tank world of the American right is incipient, they've actually done a lot of work in the past 6 years, 8 years, and versus 8 years ago when there really wasn't anybody who was credentialed, who was not already a product of the old fusionist right. And so a lot of the people who ended up in jobs, even in the cabinet, the highest level jobs in the White House, were people who weren't really on board with Trump's agenda, and in some cases actually didn't like him at all, because most of the right was arrayed, most of the sort of official elite right was arrayed against him, at least during the primaries. So that's to say that a difference will be that they will be more loyal. They'll probably be willing to go along with more of his more, shall we say, creative, legally creative initiatives. They will try to implement his agenda and not try to undermine it or sort of contain it as some of Trump's appointees did last time. So that's certainly a difference.
Yeah. And one, I don't mean this to be too cute, but one way to answer your question, especially in the United States, who to watch, it's Trump. And I think this is a difference, right? I'm not sure the quote unquote populist energies have coalesced around any single political figure in the United Kingdom like they have with Trump in the United States. And so, there's literally there are still interesting tensions. I was just reading that after Russia invaded Ukraine, when Republicans, meaning rank and file Republicans, were polled, they actually supported aid to Ukraine at higher levels than Democrats did even. But you see over time, it became the party line that sending a bunch of money and weapons to Ukraine was not what the newfangled Republican Party, so-called, would be about. And so you see sometimes the old instincts flaring up, and kind of the new line having to be kind of imposed over time. But it
works.
But it works. Yes, exactly. And so what I mean is that because Trump is a kind of authoritarian personality around which so many of the right-wing populist energies have coalesced in the United States, you watch him to see what the latest, thing that comes out of his mouth is. And then you see how the right-wing intellectuals and the institutions and think tanks we've been talking about, how they respond. How they adjust or don't, what they push back on, what they don't. I think it really is true in the United States that to understand the right, you have to watch what Trump does, because they really lick his boots,
So what do you make of the prospects then for the Tories? Because as you say, there isn't an equivalent figure with sort of populist energy behind them. And of course, when you see all those, photo of a gathering of young conservatives, you will be lucky if, more than two of them don't already have free bus passes and a regular history of colonoscopies on the NHS. There really is a very sparse youth movement when it comes to conservatism. So I guess, what do you foresee in terms of the ideological and practical scope for what the Tories do next after they almost certainly lose the next election and have to think, what now?
I didn't know a lot about Dominic Cummings before reading about him before this, and sort of is a sort of familiar figure for us in studying the American right, a sort of behind the scenes Svengali kind of figure for the populists and the Brexit movement. And I was interested in sort of interviews he was giving recently where he was just sort of so annoyed, that that the conservatives have tried to put the Brexit sort of genie back into the bottle. This version of the Tory party losing as badly as people expected it might, maybe that gives the sort of more ideologically populist kind of forces within the party to sort of a chance to regroup and figure out, how do we come up with a better message, or how do we sort of orchestrate a coup or a retakeover of this government. I think it's interesting too that we didn't talk that much about the Liz Truss fiasco, but it wasn't exactly. I know that there's a sort of element of it that is like, well, this is taking Brexit seriously. We're going to go our own way. But there's also an element of it that was sort of like zombie Thatcherism, which, was sort of reimposing of the sort of austerity and at least sort of giveaways to the wealthy that, to some degree, it seemed Boris was less invested in. So I'm certainly, worse positioned than even you are, than you are, or than anybody in the UK is to prognosticate here. But it does seem like, the fact that the version of the Labour Party that's going to take over the country is also so, so weak sauce and and ideologically vague and some kind of, retriangulation, and which has sort of purged all of its left-wing elements on purpose to make it maximally kind of anti-Corbyn and representative of some kind of, centrist consensus, means that, that's unlikely to kind of really light a fire in the belly of anybody in your country. And so the prospects for a sort of regrouping of the more radical right seems possible.
Yeah, it is interesting that the kind of economic stagnation in the UK that we've been describing seems to be mirrored by a kind of political stagnation where it does seem like Labour is so desiccated. Keir Starmer, is so pathetic in so many ways. And, but the Tories, they haven't, really adjusted to this moment we're in yet either, other than Brexit. I remember watching the debates between Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson in 2019. And, just Boris's answers about Brexit were like crisp, decisive, bold. And after Brexit, at least, which was at least a particular issue that you could talk about in distinct ways, it does seem like the Tories haven't really adapted to this moment. And it seems like just kind of two parties competing to manage decline.
Yeah.
This is where a kind of difference comes in. I do think in the United States, the working class in the next decade or two is going to be 50% people of color, right? Young people like truly hate Trump and the right. Democrats, if they can turn out young people, tend to win them in big numbers. So I do think, at least in the United States, with something like Bernie Sanders, 2 campaigns for the presidency, even the way after he was elected, you can overplay this, but there did seem to be a break with the Biden administration with neoliberal economic policies, at least to some degree. And so there are these glimmers in the United States. Young people are not on the right. It seems like maybe the neoliberal stranglehold on the Democratic Party has been broken. And there are opportunities there. However bad things are, when I look forward, that's what I see in the United States, at least some of the dynamics at work. When I look to the right in the UK and just the broader political situation there, it is striking just how uncreative and again, kind of rote and managing decline, it all seems to me. So I don't really know who to look for or what's coming down the pike, because it seems like the backdrop is one of kind of stagnation and a lack of political creativity and verve.
Okay, I'm going to ask you something that you may want to hop on a flight and strangle me for, but what do you think is going to happen in both of the elections? I'm asking you to lay your bets now on record.
Oh, great.
Sam?
Let's put some money on it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Well, seems Keir Starmer, the hero of the Labour left,
God bless him.
will win the election in your country and thereby bring about a socialist revolution that we've all been waiting for. And as everyone knows, with his very sturdy spine and strong commitment to revolution, he will do that. In the U.S., I have to say, I mean, it's very the polling is they're neck and neck basically. The last I checked, Trump may have a point or two lead over Biden in sort of general election or sort of national polling. the election will come down to, as it always does, certain swing states where the population is closely divided between Democrats and Republicans who vote. I think extremely relevant for Biden's prospects is that right now he and the Democrats, many Democratic mayors and many members of Congress have been outraging the most politically motivated class of young Democrats by their total inaction, but in fact their facilitation of the incipient genocide in Gaza. And then just last night, the day that we're recording, or the night before, there was raids of student encampments, peaceful student encampments all over the country in support of Gaza that tended to be sort of initiated by Democratic mayors, at least in New York. Our idiot Democratic mayor, he basically lied about there being some, terrorist on campus at Columbia, which justified this massive mobilization of militarized policing to come in and arrest hundreds of students. I mean, I saw today something that I have to say, I've literally never seen anything like this, which was that the college Democrats of America said that the Democrats can't rely on student votes. Now, I was a student activist in my younger days. The idea that, that it's ever been the case before that the Democrats cannot rely on the votes of the College Democrats of America, this organization, that's not true. But the fact that it is right now means that even the most bootlicking youth organizations are angry at the Democratic Party. And I have for a long time wondered whether the issue, for better or for worse, the issue of Israel and Palestine had not been a really, really salient issue for large portions of the American population. It's important to Jews. It's important to Palestinians. It's important to certain very politically motivated young people, but the actions of the Democrats, the actions of these university administrators in the past couple of weeks, I think have raised the salience enormously for the entire young, highly educated population, which is a group that Biden absolutely needs to win. And I do think it's harming his prospects. So from the standpoint of today, I say Trump wins and Biden has nobody but himself to blame.
How about you, Matt? Do you agree? Do you disagree?
I agree with Sam's diagnosis of the situation. I didn't mean for my earlier comments to be too hopeful.
None of that nonsense on Novara FM. Of course not.
Yes. But I would say, the point I hesitate on in Sam's prediction of a Trump win, or at least from the standpoint of today, thinking Trump would win, I agree it looks pretty bleak. I mean, Biden is so old, and especially his handling of Israel and Palestine, it does seem like it will make a difference in the number of young people, not just who turn out to vote for him, but the kinds of young people who go canvassing, right, and knock on doors and work phone banks and things like that. That said, so things are bleak, and Biden's not very compelling, but I think
Trump's crazy.
One thing. Yes, and the thing maybe this just proves I need to really break on through to the other side and cast off all my normal assumptions about politics. But I can't quite shake the gut feeling that as more and more people start paying attention to the election, which really isn't going to happen till late summer when the conventions happen. The news, Trump benefits from kind of not being in office and maybe, being in people's minds a little less. But I just can't help but think that, as he's going through these trials, the, criminal indictments, as people start tuning in, I don't know. I still think Biden will win.
And on that note of controversy, having sowed discord between two podcast hosts, I will have to leave it there. Matt, Sam, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, learning from you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Support
independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support. Or face the consequences.